History often tells us that the Roanoke Colony vanished into thin air. But the truth is far more calculated. When Governor John White sailed back to England in 1587, he left behind a thriving settlement with a plan for its own survival. He didn't know that a global conflict, the Spanish Armada, would trap him in Europe, effectively cutting the lifeline to his people. This wasn't a sudden, chaotic disappearance. It was a slow, agonizing drift into total isolation, forced by the one thing no one could control, the passage of time. If you are watching this right now, I want to ask you something. What really happened? Because every case you are about to hear has one thing in common. The investigation was closed. The file was sealed. And the truth was never found. These are the cases that detectives couldn't solve, that witnesses couldn't explain, and that official records couldn't account for. If you are someone who needs to know what really happened, you are in the right place. Subscribe to Unsolved Vault and join thousands of investigators uncovering the case's history left unfinished. Welcome back. This is Unsolved Vault. And today, we open a case that was never meant to stay closed. In the late summer of 1587, a small fleet prepared to leave the coast of Roanoke. Governor John White stood before a settlement that was unfinished but determined to endure. Modest homes stood among freshly cleared ground, while families organized the supplies they hoped would last until his return. The ships waiting offshore carried far more than passengers. They carried the colony's strongest connection to England and the promise that fresh provisions would soon cross the Atlantic once again. The departure unfolded with ordinary sights and quiet emotions rather than dramatic ceremony. The creak of wooden hulls mixed with waves striking the shoreline as small boats moved between land and ship. Voices called final instructions across the water before fading into the coastal wind. Those remaining watched the sails gradually catch the breeze, growing smaller against the horizon with each passing moment. Hope traveled aboard those ships, carried by the expectation that the separation would last only a short time. Once the vessels disappeared from view, the rhythm of life on Roanoke shifted almost unnoticed. The settlement continued its daily work, repairing shelters, tending crops, and gathering food while expecting familiar sails to return within months. Across the Atlantic, however, events beyond the colonists' control were already unfolding. Rising tensions between England and Spain began drawing ships, money, and attention toward military preparations, quietly delaying the voyage that had seemed so certain when the fleet first departed the island. For those left behind, absence slowly gained a different meaning. At first it represented patience, then uncertainty, and eventually unanswered questions. No messenger arrived explaining the delays unfolding across an ocean they could not see. Their understanding ended at the edge of the sea, while history continued moving elsewhere. That widening distance between expectation and reality became one of the most important turning points in the entire Roanoke story. Not because of a single dramatic event, but because silence gradually replaced every promise of a quick return. John White had not intended to abandon the colony for years. His journey to England was planned as a practical mission driven by necessity rather than choice. The settlement needed fresh supplies, additional tools, seeds, clothing, and skilled workers if it hoped to survive beyond its first difficult seasons. White also carried letters describing the colony's condition, hoping to persuade supporters that Roanoke deserved continued investment. Every plan depended upon a relatively swift return. Few people standing on the island imagined that circumstances unfolding thousands of miles away would quietly overturn those expectations. After reaching England, White entered a nation preparing for an entirely different crisis. Relations between England and Spain had grown increasingly hostile, and fears of invasion soon dominated political attention. Merchant vessels that might have sailed toward North America were instead gathered for national defense. Experienced sailors were called into military service, while ships and supplies were redirected to protect English waters. The colony across the Atlantic did not disappear from official concern, yet it could no longer compete with the urgent demands created by the approaching conflict. The situation reached a decisive moment in 1588 with the arrival of the Spanish Armada. England concentrated enormous resources on resisting the invasion fleet, achieving a victory that would later become one of the defining events of the Elizabethan era. For the Roanoke settlers, however, that historic success carried an unintended cost. The months that should have brought relief slipped away while the colony remained beyond the reach of meaningful assistance. A delay measured in weeks quietly expanded into years through circumstances no one at Roanoke could influence or even fully understand. White searched for opportunities to return, but each attempt met fresh obstacles. Suitable ships were scarce, financial backing proved uncertain, and available voyages often served priorities unrelated to the struggling settlement. Time continued moving forward with remarkable indifference. Every season that passed in England represented another season faced alone by the colonists across the Atlantic. The growing gap between departure and return slowly transformed a temporary absence into one of history's most consequential silences, setting the stage for the mystery that would eventually surround the lost colony of Roanoke. While England confronted political uncertainty and the threat of invasion, life on Roanoke continued without knowing any of those distant events. The settlers measured time through changing seasons rather than international conflict. Gardens demanded attention as weather shifted from warmth to cooler days. Food stores required careful management, and repairs continued whenever storms damaged roofs or fences. Every ordinary task carried the quiet expectation that relief would eventually arrive from across the Atlantic. The colony waited without realizing that the world beyond the horizon had begun following a very different course. Months gradually blended into longer periods of uncertainty. At first, the absence of ships may have seemed disappointing but understandable. Atlantic crossings were never perfectly predictable, and experienced sailors accepted that storms or unfavorable winds could delay voyages. Yet as one season followed another, familiar explanations became more difficult to hold with confidence. Every empty horizon invited new questions. Had the ships encountered severe weather? Had supplies been delayed? Or had something happened far away that no one on the island could possibly know? Distance created more than physical separation. It also separated knowledge itself. News traveled only as fast as ships could cross the ocean, and when no ships arrived, information disappeared with them. The colonists had no way to learn about England's military preparations, political decisions, or the growing crisis with Spain. Likewise, those remaining in England possessed no reliable understanding of how conditions were changing within the settlement. Both sides continued making decisions while lacking the facts available to the other, widening the unseen gap between expectation and reality. This silence shaped the future in subtle but profound ways. It was not the result of a deliberate choice to abandon the colony. Instead, it emerged from the limitations of 16th century travel and communication, where oceans often controlled human plans more effectively than governments could. Every passing month reduced the likelihood that Roanoke would receive timely support. By the time opportunities to return finally emerged, the settlement had already endured years of isolation, facing challenges that history would later struggle to reconstruct with certainty. John White's own experience reflected the frustration of those lost years. He remained committed to returning, yet determination alone could not overcome the realities surrounding him. Ships suitable for crossing the Atlantic were difficult to secure, and those that became available often pursued private ventures or military responsibilities before colonial support. Financial backers also faced changing priorities as England directed increasing attention toward national security. Each unsuccessful attempt added another layer of delay, extending an absence that no one had originally intended. For the people at Roanoke, every season demanded new decisions without outside guidance. Children grew older. Supplies diminished through ordinary use. Homes required constant maintenance against weather and wear. The colony could not pause its existence while waiting for help. Life continued through countless practical choices made by individuals whose names are now largely forgotten. Those daily efforts left few written records, yet they formed the quiet foundation upon which the later mystery would stand. Historians often search for a single turning point that explains why the colony disappeared. The evidence suggests something more gradual. The separation between white and the settlement widened through many small circumstances rather than one dramatic failure. Political conflict delayed ships. Military priorities redirected resources. Time quietly expanded each obstacle until temporary absence became prolonged isolation. The mystery did not begin with a vanished settlement. It began with a chain of ordinary events that slowly removed every opportunity for timely assistance. Looking back across more than 4 centuries, it is tempting to imagine that someone should have recognized the danger sooner. Yet those living through these events possessed no complete picture. White could not know how conditions were changing on Roanoke. The settlers could not understand why England remained silent. Each side acted according to the limited information available, separated by an ocean that carried ships only when weather, politics, and circumstance allowed. That shared uncertainty became one of the defining forces shaping everything that followed. Years later, when John White finally secured passage back across the Atlantic, he was returning to a place that existed more clearly in memory than in certainty. The settlement he had left behind had continued living through seasons he had never witnessed. Children had grown. Supplies had either been consumed or replaced through necessity. Countless decisions had been made without the guidance of the governor who had promised to return quickly. Time itself had quietly become the colony's greatest dividing line. The long silence between England and Roanoke reminds us how fragile communication was during the 16th century. Today, distance is measured in hours or even seconds. For the colonists, an ocean could separate people not only from assistance but from knowledge itself. News disappeared with every delayed voyage. Plans dissolved when ships changed course. Entire communities could endure years without learning why expected help had never arrived. The mystery of Roanoke cannot be understood without first recognizing the immense weight carried by that silence. Perhaps the most remarkable detail is that no evidence suggests John White intended to abandon the settlers. Contemporary records reveal repeated efforts to organize a return, each frustrated by circumstances unfolding beyond his control. Political conflict, naval priorities, scarce vessels, and financial obstacles combined into a sequence of delays that no individual could easily overcome. The colony waited faithfully for a rescue that remained real in intention but impossible in timing. The next chapter begins with White's long-awaited arrival back at Roanoke. What he expected to find was a struggling settlement grateful for overdue supplies. What greeted him instead was something far stranger. The homes were no longer occupied, the people were gone, and the silence that had stretched across the Atlantic now settled over the island itself, leaving behind only a handful of quiet clues and one of history's most enduring questions. Yet, as the years of silence stretched on, the colony remained frozen in time, waiting for a rescue that wouldn't arrive until it was far too late. And when the ships finally returned to the coast, they found a village that told a story of survival, not catastrophe. When John White finally stepped onto Roanoke Island in August 1590, The settlement before him looked strangely familiar from a distance. The outlines of the clearing could still be recognized, yet the signs of daily life had disappeared. Houses no longer stood as complete structures, and open spaces where families had once worked now lay empty beneath the trees. Nothing suggested a hurried battle. Instead, the village appeared carefully altered, as though its former residents had taken time before leaving. The silence surrounding the settlement carried its own quiet weight. No voices answered the arriving sailors, and no smoke drifted upward from cooking fires. Wind moved gently through the trees while loose branches scraped against weathered timber. Footsteps disturbed layers of fallen leaves that had gathered over abandoned paths. The ordinary sounds of the island remained, yet the familiar noises of human life had vanished, leaving behind an absence that felt more unsettling than any obvious destruction could have created. As White and his companions searched the site, small discoveries gradually reshaped their understanding. The buildings had not been burned. Many appeared to have been taken apart with care, their timbers likely reused elsewhere rather than abandoned. Valuable possessions were missing instead of scattered across the ground. These details suggested planning rather than panic. Each new observation quietly challenged the expectation that the colony had ended through sudden violence, replacing one mystery with another that seemed even harder to explain. Standing within the empty settlement, White faced a question unlike any he had imagined during the long years of delay. Relief had been prepared for struggling colonists, not for a village emptied without clear explanation. The missing people left behind almost no direct answers, only carefully shaped silence. In that moment, the greatest clue was not what remained upon the island, but what had disappeared from it. The search for lost colonists had quietly become the search for the meaning hidden within their absence. White and his companions examined the abandoned settlement with growing attention to every remaining detail. They expected that even an empty village might reveal clear evidence explaining what had happened during the years of separation. Instead, the scene offered quiet contradictions. There were no widespread signs of violent struggle. Weapons, broken furniture, or hurriedly abandoned belongings did not cover the ground. The settlement looked less like the aftermath of disaster and more like a place that had been deliberately left behind after careful preparation. One detail immediately attracted White's attention. Before leaving for England, he had agreed upon a simple system with the colonists. If they ever needed to relocate because of danger, they would carve the name of their destination into a visible object. If they departed under immediate threat, they would also carve a cross known as the Maltese cross beside the message. This arrangement offered a practical way to communicate across years of uncertainty, even if direct contact proved impossible. Remembering that agreement, White carefully searched for any surviving sign. His search revealed a remarkable clue. The word Croatoan had been carved into one of the wooden palisade posts surrounding the settlement. Nearby, the shorter word CRO appeared on a tree, though weather and age made its purpose less certain. Most importantly, no Maltese cross accompanied either carving. To White, that absence carried real meaning. It suggested that the colonists had not considered themselves under immediate attack when they left. If the original plan had been followed, they had likely moved intentionally rather than fleeing sudden violence. Yet the discovery answered only one question while opening many others. Croatoan referred to an island south of Roanoke, home to indigenous allies known to maintain generally friendly relations with the English. White naturally hoped the settlers had successfully relocated there. Unfortunately, worsening weather and difficult sailing conditions prevented an immediate search. Once again, circumstances beyond human control interrupted the investigation. The most important clue ever left by the colony had been found, but the opportunity to follow it slipped away before White could learn where that carefully carved message was truly meant to lead. The more carefully the search continued, the more unusual the abandoned settlement appeared. Heavy chests that would have been difficult to carry over long distances were gone, suggesting they had been moved with purpose rather than left behind in haste. Household goods that might have been useful for survival had also disappeared. At the same time, there was little evidence that strangers had looted the village after its abandonment. The pattern pointed toward deliberate choices made by the colonists themselves, though their destination remained uncertain. Not everything had escaped the effects of time. White later recorded that several items buried before his departure had been damaged by weather and exposure. Books had deteriorated. Maps and paintings had suffered from moisture. Iron objects showed signs of rust after years beneath the coastal climate. These discoveries revealed that nature had continued its quiet work throughout White's absence, gradually erasing traces that might once have offered clearer answers. Every passing season had removed another layer of evidence from the island. The condition of the fortifications added another subtle clue. The defensive palisade surrounding the settlement still stood in part, although age and weather had weakened sections of the wooden structure. If the colony had faced a desperate final battle, investigators might have expected widespread destruction or clear signs of assault. Instead, the remaining defenses appeared abandoned rather than violently overwhelmed. Once again, the physical evidence resisted dramatic explanations, encouraging a more careful reading of what had actually been found instead of what later legends imagined. For historians, these quiet details remain among the most valuable pieces of the Roanoke puzzle. They encourage questions grounded in observation rather than speculation. Why dismantle homes unless the timber would be needed elsewhere? Why carry away useful possessions unless there was another place to settle? Why leave a destination carved into wood if survival had already become impossible? The empty village offered no complete answers, yet each overlooked detail gently suggested that the story may have continued beyond Roanoke rather than ending within its abandoned boundaries. White's greatest frustration came from how close the answers seemed to be. The carved word pointed toward a possible destination, and the physical condition of the settlement suggested an organized departure rather than sudden destruction. The next logical step was to sail south and search Croatoan Island. White fully intended to do exactly that. After years of forced absence, he believed the final stage of the journey might require only a short voyage along the Carolina coast. Nature, however, intervened once more. Strong winds and rough seas disrupted the planned expedition before it could properly begin. The ships carrying White and his companions struggled against worsening conditions, and the captains became increasingly reluctant to continue. Practical concerns over safety eventually outweighed the hope of immediate discovery. White protested the decision, yet the final choice rested with those commanding the vessels. Once again, events beyond his control interrupted the search at the very moment it appeared closest to success. The fleet eventually turned away from the coast, leaving the carved message unexplored. That decision became one of the most painful moments recorded in White's own writings. He had returned expecting reunion, then found only clues. He had discovered a possible destination, then lost the opportunity to investigate it. History often remembers the disappearance itself, but White also experienced another kind of loss. He carried away the knowledge that the answer might have existed just beyond the horizon, separated from him by weather and circumstance rather than distance alone. From that point forward, the abandoned village became more than an empty settlement. It became a place suspended between evidence and uncertainty. Every remaining timber, every weathered path, and every carved letter invited interpretation while refusing certainty. The physical landscape preserved enough information to challenge simple explanations, yet not enough to resolve the mystery completely. That delicate balance between discovery and absence has kept Roanoke alive in historical imagination for centuries, encouraging each new generation to return to the same quiet clues in search of a clearer answer. The abandoned settlement left behind an unusual kind of evidence. Instead of revealing a violent ending, it suggested movement. Homes had been dismantled instead of burned. Useful belongings had been carried away rather than discarded. A destination had been carved into wood according to an earlier agreement, and no distress mark appeared beside it. Taken together, these details point toward a carefully organized departure far more strongly than a sudden catastrophe. The mystery survives not because there were no clues, but because the clues stopped just short of a complete explanation. For many years, popular stories transformed Roanoke into a tale of unexplained disappearance. Yet the historical record encourages a quieter interpretation. The settlers may never have intended to vanish from history at all. They may have believed they were leaving a clear message for anyone who eventually returned. If that was their expectation, then the greatest tragedy was not the move itself. It was that the final step of the search never happened when the evidence was still fresh, and the trail could perhaps have been followed. Every unanswered question surrounding the empty village invites another careful observation rather than a dramatic conclusion. The silence found by John White was not empty in the ordinary sense. It contained traces of planning, adaptation, and human decision. The colony had left behind signs of purpose, yet time, weather, and missed opportunities gradually blurred their meaning. The passing centuries added legend to the story, but they also carried away evidence that might once have settled the debate. The next chapter turns away from the abandoned settlement and focuses on the most famous clue of all. One carved word has shaped more discussion than any other detail connected to Roanoke. Understanding what that message may have meant, why it was left behind, and how historians continue to interpret it brings us closer to the possibility that the colonists were not trying to disappear. They may have been trying to tell future visitors exactly where they had gone. Everything changed with a single glance at a wooden post. There, etched into the grain of the timber, was a name that promised an answer to the entire mystery. But was this a desperate final message, or a deliberate map for those who knew where to look? Among every clue left behind at Roanoke, one carved word has endured longer than weathered buildings or forgotten possessions. The letters spelling Croatoan were cut deeply into a wooden post where they could be easily found by anyone returning to the settlement. Nearby, the shorter inscription CRO appeared on a tree, though its purpose remains uncertain. The carvings were plain rather than decorative, suggesting they were created to communicate something practical instead of leaving behind a symbolic message. Imagine arriving after years at sea and finding only those carefully shaped letters waiting in silence. The rough surface of the wood still carried the marks left by a sharp blade. Salt air, rain, and changing seasons had begun wearing away the edges, yet the message remained readable. Every glance toward the carving invited another question. It felt less like a farewell and more like an unfinished conversation, preserved by chance while nearly everything else connected to the colony had disappeared. As historians compared White's written account with the evidence found at Roanoke, another important detail quietly gained significance. Before his departure, White and the settlers had agreed upon a simple emergency signal. If danger forced the colony to leave under immediate threat, they would carve a Maltese cross beside the name of their destination. When White returned, no such cross appeared with the words Croatoan. That small omission transformed the meaning of the entire message, suggesting a planned relocation instead of a desperate escape. The mystery surrounding the carving lies not only in what it says, but also in what it deliberately leaves unsaid. A single word cannot explain who traveled, when they departed, or what happened afterward. Yet it carries the calm confidence of people expecting someone to understand its meaning. Rather than closing the story, the inscription quietly opens another path of inquiry, inviting us to consider that the colonists may have believed they had already provided the answer future generations would spend centuries trying to uncover. To understand the importance of the carving, it helps to consider what the name Croatoan meant in 1590. It was not a mysterious word chosen at random. Croatoan referred to an island south of Roanoke, known today as Hatteras Island, where an indigenous community with generally friendly ties to the English lived. John White had visited the area during earlier expeditions and was familiar with its people. The location already existed within the colony's experience, making it a practical destination rather than an unknown refuge. The agreement between White and the settlers gave the message a clear purpose. If circumstances required the colony to move, the new location would be carved where returning ships could easily discover it. The system depended upon trust. White trusted the colonists to leave an understandable record, while the settlers trusted that he would eventually return and recognize it. The carved word was therefore more than a place name. It represented an attempt to bridge years of separation through a simple plan created before White sailed back to England. Many later retellings transformed the inscription into an unsolvable riddle, but White himself interpreted it differently. According to his own account, he believed the colonists had likely relocated to Croatoan. His immediate intention was to search there as quickly as weather permitted. The clue did not confuse him. Instead, it appeared to confirm the very communication system he had established before leaving the settlement. Only unfavorable conditions prevented him from following the evidence while it was still relatively fresh. This perspective quietly changes the way the mystery is often imagined. The carving was never presented as a supernatural sign or an impossible code. It was a practical message left by people expecting it to be understood. The tragedy lies not in the existence of the clue, but in the failure to pursue it immediately. Storms, difficult seas, and circumstances beyond White's control interrupted that final journey, allowing the passage of time to transform a straightforward direction into one of history's most debated historical clues. The absence of the Maltese cross deserves as much attention as the carved word itself. Historical mysteries often encourage people to focus on what can be seen, yet missing details can carry equal importance. White had specifically instructed the settlers to add the cross if they were forced to leave because of immediate danger or attack. When he found only the place name, he naturally concluded that the colony had departed under more controlled circumstances. That conclusion came not from modern speculation, but from the agreement the colonists themselves had established years earlier. Of course, no single clue can remove every uncertainty. The settlers may have intended to carve additional information that was later lost to weather. They may have expected White to find them quickly, making further explanation unnecessary. It is also possible that events changed after the message had been carved, leaving no opportunity to update it. These possibilities remind us that the surviving evidence captures only one brief moment within a much longer story that remains largely hidden from the historical record. Researchers continue to examine the physical evidence with remarkable care. The style of the lettering, the location of the carvings, and White's written description have all received detailed attention. Although interpretations differ on many aspects of the Roanoke mystery, the existence of the communication plan itself is well documented. That simple fact gives the inscription unusual historical value. It was not an accidental mark discovered centuries later. It formed part of a deliberate strategy created by people expecting separation and hoping to overcome it. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of the carving is its quiet confidence. The settlers did not appear to believe they were leaving behind an impossible puzzle. They acted as though future visitors would understand exactly what the message meant. That assumption suggests planning, cooperation, and hope rather than confusion. Even after generations of debate, the carved word continues inviting the same thoughtful question. Was the colony trying to tell us where it vanished, or where it had chosen to begin again? As the centuries passed, the single word Croatoan gradually took on a life far beyond its original purpose. Writers, artists, and storytellers often treated it as a symbol of mystery itself, separating it from the practical circumstances in which it had been carved. Popular imagination filled the silence surrounding the colony with dramatic theories, while the inscription quietly remained what it had always been. A place name left by people who expected someone to read it and understand where to look next. Modern historians often return to the original documents with a different perspective. Instead of asking what fantastic meaning the word might conceal, they ask how the colonists themselves would have understood it. Viewed through that historical lens, the carving appears remarkably straightforward. It points toward a known destination connected to earlier English expeditions and established indigenous communities. The message gains its greatest significance not from mystery but from context, reminding us that historical evidence often becomes clearer when read through the expectations of the people who created it. Even so, the inscription cannot answer every important question. It tells us where the settlers may have intended to go, but it remains silent about what happened after they arrived. Did every colonist travel together? Did some remain behind while others continued farther inland? Did later events alter their plans after the carving had already been completed? The word opens one doorway while leaving many rooms beyond it unexplored, preserving both direction and uncertainty within the same brief message. This balance between clarity and mystery explains why the carving continues to attract careful study. It neither solves the disappearance nor leaves investigators without guidance. Instead, it invites a disciplined search built upon evidence rather than imagination. The letters carved into weathered would continue pointing toward a possibility that has never completely disappeared. If the settlers truly intended future visitors to follow their trail, then understanding that simple inscription may still represent the closest approach history has ever made to hearing the colony speak for itself. The carved word has survived because it stands at the meeting point between certainty and uncertainty. We know it was there. We know John White recorded it. We know it matched an agreement made before his departure. Beyond those facts, the historical trail grows quieter. The inscription offers direction but not conclusion, inviting each generation to examine the same evidence with fresh questions rather than easy answers. Perhaps the greatest lesson hidden within the carving is that communication succeeded only in part. The settlers appear to have done exactly what they believed was necessary. They left a destination where it could be found, and they omitted the emergency distress mark that would have signaled immediate danger. Their side of the message was completed with care. What failed was not the act of communication itself, but the chain of events that prevented anyone from following it while the trail remained fresh. That distinction changes the entire character of the Roanoke mystery. Instead of imagining a colony that disappeared without leaving any trace, we find people who attempted to explain their movements in the clearest way they knew. Time, storms, delayed voyages, and fading evidence gradually transformed that practical decision into an enduring historical puzzle. The silence surrounding Roanoke was never entirely empty. It contained a message that history could read, but not fully pursue. The next chapter follows those who tried to continue the search after White's return. Explorers, colonial leaders, and later investigators repeatedly ventured into the surrounding region, hoping that scattered reports, forgotten settlements, or overlooked evidence might reveal where the Roanoke colonists had gone. Their journeys would stretch across years and eventually centuries, proving that the search for the lost colony did not end at the abandoned village. In many ways, it had only just begun. The carving pointed south, toward Croatoan, a place of allies and fresh hope. But as the investigation deepened, so did the confusion. Governor White stood on the shore, staring at a lead that felt like the missing piece of the puzzle, yet nature itself seemed determined to stop him from following it. The final, brutal reality of the colony's fate is waiting. The truth behind their last known steps is coming, releasing in just 48 hours.